seen as one of the goals of this. So only about 2.5% of stops end up resulting in the recovery of a weapon or drug. And so we're going to link these crime data to our student outcomes using New York City middle school students from 2006 to 2012. We're going to link it by school location. So we know the location of every middle school student, and so we know the precinct of that middle school. And so that's how we're going to link these two data sets. We don't have home addresses, although I wish we did. Part of the reason for focusing on middle school students is that most middle school students attend their zone middle school, and most middle school students walk to school. This is something that's different from high school students, and something I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A. All right, really briefly, so this is just the raw map across precincts in New York City of average stop concentrations. The areas that are highlighted in a darker shade indicate more stops. Same thing with crime in the right panel. And so you'll notice that areas where there are a lot of stops, there are also areas typically where there's a lot of crime. These are big areas like Harlem, some areas in Brooklyn, such as Bed-Stuy, East New York is another area. So there's a lot of correlation, not only between stops and crime, but a whole bunch of other characteristics that you could imagine. So of course, we don't want to just look at the correlation between these two things. And what we'll end up doing, as I motivated before, is looking at this variation driven by the movement of commanders across precincts, where we only estimate a commander effect based on their tenure during a different time period and in a different precinct. So I'm calling this a leave precinct out commander effect. So to do that, I won't spend much time on this slide, but it should be very familiar by now because it seems like every presentation has estimated some form of a value-added model, which is essentially what this is. But instead of looking at test scores or student achievement as the outcome variable, I'm going to look at the number of stops that occur in a given precinct month. And I'm going to condition on crime and stops and frisks that occurred in the precinct, but during the prior commander's tenure. So this is going to serve as my lagged estimate of crime and policing. Also, I'm going to condition on immutable features of that precinct, such as just the average, some average income that comes from census data, and also including year-month fixed effects. Then I'm going to get a residual from that model and in a standard value-added fashion, sort of isolate the portion in a shrunken empirical Bayes way of estimating the portion that's attributable to a commander. Here's this distribution, the empirical distribution of the commander effects. So the standard deviation is 29 stops per month. I think one of the, to compare this to teacher value added, I think it's interesting. It sort of depends what grade and subject you're looking at, but I would say that this is sort of roughly double the amount of variance that's accounted for in residual test scores by teachers. So 12% of the residual variance in stops is accounted for by commanders. I think this highlights some important aspect of looking at other outcomes other than just test scores, and sort of taking this technology that we've developed for test scores and applying it to different domains. It suggests that on-the-ground policing is in fact to some degree varying at the commander or at the high-level decision-making level. So I think that's important to note. In terms of our first stage, it's going to be very similar to most of the value-added framework. We're going to look at the number of stops that occur in a given precinct month. The main predictor is going to be this empirical Bayes shrunken commander effect. Again, this is based only on prior tenure data from that commander, which means from a different tenure in a different time period. We're going to condition also on baseline crime and stop and frisk that happened in that precinct during the prior commander's tenure, and we'll include year, month, and precinct fixed effects. So we see, much like the value-added literature, when a high stop commander enters a precinct, stops do indeed increase. It's actually nice that I was following Natalie's presentation. She sort of motivated this pretty well. And in my next slide, you'll see an event study that looks exactly like what she just presented. But we would expect a coefficient of 1 if our estimates of commander effects on stops were perfectly unbiased predictors on average of the change in stops when a commander enters a precinct. And so that's basically exactly what we're seeing in this chart here. So we see that changes in commanders' predicted effects do in fact translate to changes in actual stops once that commander moves into a new precinct. And I sort of motivated this before, but it suggests, if you think about this sort of in a principal-agent framework, it suggests that commanders or principals do indeed have some level of control over the agents or officers who are actually the ones on the ground doing these stops. The commanders themselves are not the ones doing the stops. And this preference for high stops seems to translate across different precincts or different contexts. Here's the event study. I won't spend much time on this, but it's actually almost the exact same picture that Natalie showed. So there's no trend prior to a commander switching within a precinct, but then once that commander switches, so that's in between time period -1 and 0, we see a sharp increase in the number of stops, and it corresponds to exactly the change that we would expect. And that's persistent across the first 18 months of a commander's tenure. The other thing to note that's perhaps interesting for this context, it does fade out. So if I were to extend this chart over, say, 4 or 5 years, you'll notice that it won't persist too far beyond the 18 months that are shown here. But that's because commanders only spend about 2.5 years on average within their precinct, and then other commanders come in. So it is sort of a temporary effect that you see, and that's driven by this sort of frequent movement of commanders across precincts. Okay, really quickly, just some basic balance checks. So the key identifying assumption is that we want our estimates of commander effects on stops to be uncorrelated with any of the other features of precincts that might affect educational attainment. So we run a test of this by estimating both individually and jointly a whole range of different outcomes, both in terms of crime, policing, and education. We find that none of these coefficients are individually or jointly predictive of the incoming commander's effect in a precinct. Now to estimate the reduced form effect, so to get to sort of our main results, we're going to have some outcome YIT, which is going to be some student level outcome of interest, and we're going to see how this mu hat JT, in other words, the commander's empirical Bayes shrunken effect, again, based only on prior tenure data in prior years, how that relates to this outcome. And we're going to also condition on students' baseline test scores, baseline characteristics, and fixed effects for each school year. All right, sorry, I know that was fast, but I wanted to get through it quickly so I had time to at least start to show some of the main results. So this is the net effect across all students. The unit here is a 1 standard increase in commander effect, and we're looking at that effect on average over a student's middle school exposure. So when you sort of multiply this up, it's a 1 standard increase in commander effect translates to roughly 1,000 additional stops in that precinct over 3 years. And so this reduces high school graduation rates on average, reduces college enrollment, no effects on net for the 4-year college enrollment, and negative effects on persistence. And just a note on how to interpret this. So a 1 standard deviation increase in commander effect on average throughout middle school reduces college enrollment by about 1 percentage point, which is about 2% from the mean. And you'll see the sample means in brackets below in this chart. So these net effects can obscure important differences by race. We see that these negative effects are substantially larger when you look only at Black students, where everything is now statistically significant and much larger in magnitude. There are no effects for Hispanic students largely, although they're all sort of, the point estimates are all negative, maybe a little bit in terms of college persistence, but not as much in terms of Hispanic students. But that's perhaps less surprising because they're stopped at much lower rates than Black students are. And for white and Asian students, interestingly, we find some evidence of what you might call positive spillover effects. These students and perhaps individuals, at least within their, if they interact mostly with individuals in their same race, they're going to have fewer direct and indirect effects of stop and frisk. And so you might expect to see some positive spillovers through that channel. And that is indeed partially what we're seeing here. So there's actually benefits on white and Asian students in terms of high school graduation and four-year college enrollment. Now, so far, we've been talking about the effects of stops. If you imagine the continuum of sort of the level of aggression or aggressive policing that you could imagine, stops might be at one end of the spectrum. Some of the things that have been in the news lately are at the other end of the spectrum, and frisks is starting to get somewhere in the middle. So it represents a more aggressive interaction than a stop would. A frisk is actually, police making physical contact with you. And here again, we see very much the same results, although the interpretation is a little bit difficult. I can talk about this more in the question and answer if you want, but this is a 1 standard deviation increase in the commander effect on frisks, which is about 500 additional frisks over the course of middle school. But again, largely we see differences by race here, negative effects for Black students and evidence of positive effects for white and Asian students. Okay, so a number of robustness analyses. I'm not going to go into these, but I'm happy to click on any of them if people have questions and want me to. We estimate effects by grade. We find that the results are largely robust across every single grade, so it doesn't appear like there are strong differences in terms of being exposed in 6th grade versus 7th grade versus 8th grade. We also report results along the extensive margin. So that is, if you were ever exposed in any year to a high stop commander in middle school, we actually find, I think the results here are quite interesting, and it suggests that being exposed for just a single year really explains a lot of our results. We do race-specific value added as well, so we can estimate the value added for each commander in terms of whether or not they're more likely to stop Black individuals versus white versus Hispanic. We find that the first stages are all predictive, but that in terms of the long run results, everything is flowing through the Black value added estimate on Black students. And in particular, these positive spillovers that I was showing before completely disappear. So if you estimate the white value added on white outcomes, there's no benefit whatsoever. So it does indeed sort of lend support to this spillover hypothesis rather than there being somehow some direct benefit of stops for white people. Lastly, and I suspect there will be some questions about this in the end, we find very similar results by gender, although we find within gender very similar racial differences across Black and white and Asian students. In terms of mechanisms, so you could imagine the positive results that we're seeing for white and Asian students perhaps being driven by incapacitation effects. So if you're removing through arrests, for example, the students who are most likely to cause disruptions in schools, that could potentially be one mechanism for seeing improvements to outcomes along some dimension. We find no evidence of that. We do, however, find evidence that school safety improves. So we use the VADIR data. It's data on violent and disruptive incidents that occur in New York schools. And we see that the number of violent and disruptive incidents across a range of dimensions, both sort of low-level incidents to really dangerous incidents, all decrease across the board when stops increase. We find in terms of students' self-reported perceptions of safety that they differ substantially by race. So students in primarily Black schools report feeling far less safe than students in primarily white schools. And the last piece to note is system avoidance. So we find strong increases in chronic absenteeism among Black students. And I'll just, I think someone had a question about this, so I'll just quickly show this chart where if we predict—
Hey, Andrew, I'm gonna have to cut you off. You're out of time. If you could just maybe put up your conclusion slide, and if it comes up in the question period, maybe you can go back to what it was.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Here,
okay.
Mike, I won't talk about the conclusions, and I'm happy to address those in the questions.
Okay, so the first question is going to come from Marty West, and Maria Fitzpatrick asked a similar question. So they've both been made panelists. Marty, would you ask the question, and then Maria, you can chime in if you feel like it.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Caroline. First, Andrew, this is great work, and I'm really impressed by the data collection strategy in particular, looking at commander transitions. I'd just wanted to confirm that I'm understanding it correctly, that what you're estimating here is the effects of having a local precinct commander with a propensity to use stop and frisk, as opposed to speaking to the effects of stop and frisk per se. And you spoke to this a little bit along the way in the presentation, but I felt like what was missing was more of an effort to convince us that an increased number of stops is the mechanism, as opposed to other aspects of policing that commanders could control, potentially even including the deployment and use of school resource officers. So, you find these impacts on students' perceptions of safety in schools that seem like there may be other things going on. So just wanted to hear more about that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I'll answer forgive me if I forget to answer all of the points of it. I'll start off by saying that in response to your point about seeing effects both in terms of students' perceptions of safety in schools and out of schools, the racial differences are a lot larger outside of schools than they are inside of schools. So I think that does provide some evidence that a lot of what's happening is outside of schools, but we do see racial differences within schools. But we're not estimating anything specifically driven by school resource officers, as I mentioned before, although it could be that there is some sort of communication between the police and principals or school resource officers. I think Dick Murnane had a question about how school resource officers might want to interact with police commanders, but it's not something that's part of their direct control. And so what we're capturing doesn't have a direct relationship with school resource officers. To your larger point, absolutely, and I'm really glad that you brought it up. We're not estimating the effect, holding everything constant, of increasing stops by 1 unit, let's say. What we're estimating is this whole vector of trade-offs that go into pursuing a high stop strategy. And there could be, if you're going to naturally devote more resources to stopping individuals, you're also going to face some trade-offs. You're likely going to have to do less of something else, maybe less community policing or something along those lines. And so what we're picking up is this whole vector of strategic trade-offs that come into play when pursuing a high stop strategy, rather than the specific effect of a stop. And so I think we tried to take care to talk about that in the paper, but maybe didn't come across so clearly in the 29 minutes here. And the last thing to say is a quick plug. There's a secondary paper that Elijah and I have that does dig into this more, and we estimate commander effects along a number of different dimensions. So I'd encourage people who are particularly interested in that to check out that other paper.
So the good news about this, Andrew, is that I accidentally sent that paper to a lot of the participants in this session. So lots and lots of people have it. But if not, you can get it from me. If you can't, you can easily find it on the web. Maria, did you want to chime in, or did you feel like your question was answered by Andrew in his last answer?
He answered a lot of the question. I'll give others opportunity to talk.
Okay, great. So Alex, you're up next, and then Chris, Kaepernick, you're going to be up after that. So Alex, go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. Turn off the air conditioner so I don't hear that in the background. So my question was about this avoidance effect. I was wondering if you could flesh out basically the way that people respond to this by looking at whether there's and actually I'm going to bring up the question to make sure I've got it right. All right, don't improvise. So the question is basically whether you can see whether there's a commensurate decrease in in-school interactions with the system that would tell us whether the avoidance effect was global or concentrated among people who had a high baseline likelihood of having such an interaction.
Yeah, I love, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I love when people ask questions where I have the answers in an appendix table. And I think that this answers your question, which is that if we predict students who are likely to engage in antisocial behavior based on a whole bunch of baseline characteristics from elementary school, we can characterize them in below median and above median. And we see that the avoidance is highly concentrated. Well, it differs a lot by race, as everything else in this chart, but within race, it differs a lot by above and below median in terms of your predicted likelihood of engaging in antisocial behavior. And so I think that this is answering your question. And so to some degree, I guess for Black students, to some degree, it looks like it's global a bit, although the effects are much larger among those who are who are more likely to engage in antisocial behavior based on prior characteristics.
Right, yeah. Okay, Chris Carbonik.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Andrea and Elia. That was super fascinating. So I guess I have two short questions from the ones that I sent you. The first one is if you could speak a little bit more to this gender similarity. I found it absolutely fascinating, and that, you know, the symmetry across race and the fact that the point estimates for females are pretty much identical, irrespective of the race.
Yeah, I might mention that was brought up by a number of other questioners as well. So the lack of different effects by gender was definitely a big question. Go ahead,
and I think part of that could be, you know, what you said, that is much more about some general equilibrium effect, or, you know, something that's happening outside of that policy itself, which leads me to the second question. You know, what is the relevant place to study here? Is it the place you live, or is it the place you go to school? And I think this leads also to the point that Scott Carell brought up is, you know, why not look at also high school and whether there are, you know, some compounding effects. So if you draw, like, you know, strict precinct commander in middle school and then also in high school, is it worse? Or perhaps, you know, the people that drew strict commander during the middle school, they try to move out to high schools in different precincts where these kind of policy is practiced much to a lesser degree. Thank you. I think it was great.
Thank you. I'll try to, I think I noted 4 questions in there, and I'll try to address all of them briefly because I know we're probably out of time. But in terms of the compounding effects in high school, that's not something that we had considered, but a number of people brought that up. And so I think that's a great idea to look at whether or not there's some sort of compounding that happens between middle school and high school. The reason we didn't focus so much on high school is we're concerned that we might be endogenously losing students from the sample. So, you know, if a certain student is assigned to a high school where they're getting stopped a lot on the way to school, they might just drop out and we may no longer see them in our data. I think there's probably ways that we can get around that, but that was sort of the motivation for focusing on middle schools to begin with, at least. In terms of where you live versus where you go to school, that's another reason why we thought it was important to focus on middle schools. Most middle school students attend their zone middle school and they walk to school. The same is not true for high school students. And so in this case, I think we are getting some combined effect largely of where you live and where you go to school. But one opportunity that we haven't explored yet, we might be constrained due to data limitations, but it occurred to me that we might be able to tease out magnet schools. I think there's only a handful of them in middle school, but we might be able to see how the effects differ for magnet schools, which are much more likely to not be in the same area that you live. And finally, I think what I find your most fascinating question is something that came up from a bunch of people, is the similarity in results across males and females. And I think that also was fascinating to me. It was not what I expected when I did this, when I started on this. And I think there are 2 likely explanations, and I'm not sure how to differentiate the 2 or how to figure out which one is playing a larger role. But one thing could be, and there's some work in sociology about this, the effect of being stopped by the police or being frisked by the police. A single stop might have a larger impact for females than it does for males. I think there's a lot of anecdotal and also just ethnographic research that supports this. So it's possible that even though females are stopped less frequently, the impact of that stop is different for men and women. So that's one thing. The other is that it could simply be flowing, the effects could be flowing not through the direct effect of stops. And this is not something we ever tried to argue in the paper. I think it's likely that there are indirect effects that are flowing through maybe your uncle being stopped or your parent being stopped, which could affect males and females similarly. And the last thing I'll say, I think Eric Taylor had a question about this, looking into whether or not we could address effects on teachers. So I think that could be an interesting avenue to explore as we dig through this a little bit more.
So we're really out of time, but I want to just let two additional people ask their questions. And Andrew, I'm not going to allow you to respond to them right away. Maybe you can give a tiny response, but it's Will Jobby and Scott Carroll in that order. So if you could unmute yourselves and at least get your questions out there so everyone can hear them. Will?
Yeah, thank you so much. Andrew, I was curious if you've estimated reduced form effects in the post-2013 period, because I could imagine that if you're still finding effects, that tells us it's something other than stop and frisk. Whereas if the effects completely go away, that's really telling us it's stop and frisk exactly, or something that's very, very closely correlated that's driving the results.
Yeah, I think
that's a great suggestion. Andrew, no, you're not allowed to answer.
Sorry.
Let Scott Carroll get his question out too, and then you can give a short answer to both of them at once, kind of in combination. Scott?
Great paper. What I would like to see you do is start with looking at dynamic effects, meaning you clarified one of my questions, but you're using the average value added throughout a student's middle school term. So why not start and look at the yearly variation on, say, test scores, absenteeism, and discipline using the yearly data at the school level. And then another quick thing I just thought of, if you have data on the age of the individuals who are stopped and frisked, you might be able to get more at, is it middle school students being stopped that causes this, or is it older adults, high school students, et cetera, that's driving your effects?
Okay, go ahead, Andrew.
Thanks. I'll answer in 15 seconds. So for Will's question, it's something that Elijah and I talked about a couple days ago, and we haven't done, and it's like top of our to-do list. I think it's a great suggestion. So we're going to do that next. That's the next thing to do. In terms of the dynamic effects, I love that point. I've been wrestling with how to estimate what I think is sort of an endogenous outcome in terms of test scores, let's say. If you're less likely to show up for school because you're getting stopped a lot, it's going to change the composition of students who sit for the test. So if people have ideas on how to deal with that, I'd love to follow up with me after this. So thank you. It's a great point. Well taken.
Okay, so I'm going to close out our session today. I really want to thank everyone who participated in the NBR Economics of Education this year, especially the authors and everyone who submitted questions and everyone who participated in the chats and